It was late autumn when I decided to get away for a bit. The weather had started to turn cold. The leaves were piled high against the old cabin, and I could tell the woods around it were losing their vibrancy. I'd been wanting to take a break from the usual grind. No emails, no city noise, just me and my dog, Milo. He'd been my companion for the last 3 years, always there when I needed him most. The idea of escaping to the cabin for a weekend felt like the perfect way to recharge. The cabin wasn't much, just an old, 2-story wooden structure on the edge of the woods, about 2 hours north of town. It belonged to an old friend of mine, a guy named Jonah. He had inherited it from his grandparents but had no interest in keeping it up. I loved the place, though. It was simple, isolated, and the silence out there was unlike anything I could get in the city. The drive there was long, but it was peaceful. The road twisted and turned through thick forests, with the occasional break in the trees to show me vast open fields dotted with farmhouses. Milo was quiet in the back seat, his head on the window, eyes watching the world pass by. By the time I pulled into the small gravel driveway leading up to the cabin, dusk had settled in. A thin layer of fog had crept over the field, making everything look eerie. I grabbed my bag and a few supplies from the car and made my way to the door, Milo following closely behind, tail wagging. The first thing that hit me when I opened the door was the smell of old wood. The cabin had been closed up for a while, and dust had accumulated on the furniture, the countertops, and even the windowsills. But it was cozy enough. I liked the feeling of being in a place that had been left untouched for so long. The wood-paneled walls, the old stone fireplace, the mismatched furniture. All of it gave the cabin a charm I couldn't explain. I set my stuff down on the worn-out sofa and went to start a fire. Milo curled up by the door, his ears perked up, as if he was already settling into the rhythm of the place. Once the fire was crackling, I unpacked a few essentials. Snacks, a couple of books, and a bottle of whiskey Jonah had left behind. I poured myself a drink and let the warmth of the fire sink into my bones. The first night was uneventful. The wind howled outside, but the cabin was snug. Milo stayed by the fire, only getting up occasionally to scratch at the door or wander around the room. As the night dragged on, the fire slowly dimmed, and I finally went to bed. Milo jumped up beside me, curling into a tight ball. It didn't take long for me to fall asleep. I woke up sometime after midnight. The wind had picked up, and now the trees outside were creaking and groaning. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard something else. An unmistakable sound of something scraping against the side of the cabin. My heart stopped for a moment. I tried to shake off the sudden unease that gripped me. I lay still in bed, listening intently. The sound came again, scraping, dragging, and then a soft thud. Milo stirred next to me, his body tense, his eyes wide open. He stared at the door for a long moment before getting up and padding over to the window. I stood up quietly, trying not to disturb him, and made my way to the door. My breath came out in small clouds as I peered through the frosted window pane, but the fog outside made it hard to see anything. The cabin was isolated, sure, but this felt different, like there was something out there. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The scraping noise came again, followed by another thud, this time louder. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and slowly made my way outside, my heart pounding in my chest. Milo followed right behind me, keeping close. We stepped out onto the porch, and I shined the light toward the edge of the woods. The beam caught nothing but trees and fog, but I felt the weight of something else pressing in around us. The silence was deafening. Even the wind had died down. My pulse was racing as I scanned the woods, my breath visible in the air. Then I heard it, a rustling in the underbrush, something moving fast, like it was trying to get away. Milo immediately tensed, his hackles raised, and let out a low growl. Before I could react, I heard another noise, this one much closer. It was coming from behind the cabin. I turned around to see a shadow moving along the edge of the trees. It wasn't big, but it was moving fast, ducking between the trees as if it were trying to stay hidden. My first instinct was to go inside, lock the door, and pretend I didn't see it. But something about the movement unsettled me. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a stray animal or someone passing through. I made my way back inside, locking the door behind me. Milo stayed by my side, still alert. I sat on the couch, trying to steady my breath, but the unease lingered. The fire had died down to nothing more than glowing embers, and the house felt colder. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, and the silence was so deep it was suffocating. Minutes passed before I dared to check outside again. I opened the door just enough to peer out, shining my flashlight in the direction of the movement. The fog had thickened even more, and I couldn't see anything clearly. Then, a sharp bark from Milo broke the stillness. He darted forward, growling, and I had no choice but to follow. He bolted toward the side of the cabin, his body low to the ground. My breath caught in my throat as I saw what he was reacting to. A dark figure was crouched by the cabin's corner, barely visible through the thick fog. I felt a chill run down my spine. The figure stood and turned toward us, moving in a slow, deliberate manner. I could see now that it was a man, but he was wearing something strange, dark, ragged clothes that blended into the shadows. His face was obscured by a hood, and he didn't speak. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice shaky. The man didn't respond, just stood there, staring at us. Milo growled louder, but I held him back. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of the situation. What was he doing here? How had he gotten this close without me noticing? I took a step back, and Milo followed, still growling low in his throat. The man finally moved, taking a slow, purposeful step toward me. I felt the ground beneath me shift, my heart pounding in my chest. Then, just as quickly, he turned and disappeared into the fog. I stood frozen for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. My mind was racing, but one thing was clear: this wasn't just a random encounter. Whoever that man was, he was not someone I wanted to meet again. I took a deep breath, grabbed my phone, and called the local sheriff's office. They promised to send someone out first thing in the morning, but I wasn't sure I could sleep after that. The rest of the night was uneventful, but my nerves were shot. I didn't sleep much. Milo stayed close, always watching, his body tense as if he too felt the lingering presence of whoever or whatever had been out there. The next morning, I packed up my things early. I didn't want to be there any longer than necessary. As I was about to leave, I noticed a small, tattered piece of cloth caught in the barbed wire fence just outside the cabin. It was the same dark fabric the man had been wearing. With a shudder, I grabbed Milo, got in my car, and left. The silence of the cabin, the isolation, and the feeling of being watched were too much. I never went back, but sometimes, when the fog rolls in thick around my home, I hear a distant scraping sound that makes my skin crawl. I wasn't sure what exactly had drawn me to the old cabin at first. Maybe it was the quiet pull of curiosity, or the way the place stood isolated on that stretch of forgotten road. The trees around it seemed to press in like they were holding the world at bay, casting long shadows over the cabin's rotting wooden exterior. I should have known better than to pull over, but the truck had been running low on fuel, and the sun had already dipped below the horizon. It was late October, and I was out in the middle of nowhere, some backwoods near Asheville, North Carolina. I'd been on a long drive, trying to escape the noise of the city and just clear my head for a few days. The air felt thick with the kind of silence that makes you wonder what's lurking just out of sight. The cabin itself looked ancient, paint peeling from the walls, the roof sagging in places, and the overgrown weeds that had long since claimed the porch, turning it into a breeding ground for bugs and whatever else had made it their home. It was the kind of place that didn't seem like it had been touched in years, maybe even decades. No lights inside, no smoke rising from a chimney, just stillness. I was tired, though. Tired in a way that made it hard to think straight, and the idea of stretching out in a quiet, warm place, even one that seemed completely abandoned, felt too tempting. I walked around the cabin first, just to make sure no one was inside. The windows were dark, no movement, no signs of life. There was an old pickup truck sitting next to the cabin, rusted and buried under a mound of leaves, but I didn't think anything of it. The place didn't seem like it had seen anyone in ages. Still, I hesitated at the door. The handle was an old brass one, tarnished with age, and it creaked when I pushed down on it. The door opened with a protest, and I stepped into the cabin. The smell of mold and damp would hitting me like a wall. The air was cold, but it wasn't the kind of cold that bites. It was a stagnant kind, the kind that sits in old places where the air has been trapped for too long. I stood in the entryway for a moment, just listening. There was nothing. No creaks of the floor, no distant sounds of wildlife. Just the silence that was starting to feel a little too heavy. The room I entered had a single window, covered with a layer of grime so thick that no light could penetrate. Dust motes hung in the air, swirling around in the weak light filtering through the cracks in the boards. The walls were lined with shelves, some empty, others holding old, faded books and random pieces of junk. Broken picture frames, chipped ceramic mugs, and a few rusty tools that looked like they hadn't been used in years. The old couch in the corner had the remains of something. A rat's nest. Maybe? It didn't matter. The place didn't seem dangerous, just forgotten. The kitchen was a mess, but not in the way you'd expect. It wasn't cluttered or lived in. It was the kind of mess that suggested no one had bothered to clean up for decades. Old newspapers piled up in the corner, the yellowed edges curling with age. I wandered further into the cabin, drawn to the back hallway that led to what I assumed was a bedroom. The floorboards groaned under my weight, making me wince every time I took a step. I reached the door to the bedroom, and it creaked open, revealing a small, dark space. The bed frame was there, but no mattress. Just the frame stripped of everything. It didn't seem like anyone had slept here for a long time. I felt my skin prickling with unease. There was something about this place that made my stomach twist, but I couldn't put my finger on what it was. I moved to the window to see if there was any sign of movement outside. Nothing. No headlights in the distance, no signs of life. As I turned to leave the room, I noticed something odd on the floor. A pile of old papers, tucked underneath the bed frame, mostly crumpled, but a few sheets of them were still flat. My curiosity got the better of me, and I crouched down, carefully pulling them out. They were letters dated from the late 1940s. Most of them were unreadable, the ink smudged and the paper brittle from age, but there were a few that I could make out. They seemed to be from a man to a woman, filled with desperate pleas and a few mentions of getting out of here and the truth will come out. The last letter was dated in 1952 and it was the clearest of all. Simply read, *, they know. It's too late. Don't come looking for me. Stay away from the cabin. *, I stood there, staring at it for a moment longer than I should have, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had stumbled onto something I shouldn't have. My mind started racing with questions. What happened here? Who had lived here? And why had they left so abruptly? The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as a sound echoed through the cabin. Sharp and clear, like a distant door slamming shut. I froze, heart hammering in my chest. I wasn't alone. I quickly dropped the letters, but my legs felt like they were made of stone. I didn't know if I should stay or leave, but I knew I needed to figure out what that sound was. I walked slowly back into the main room, trying to make as little noise as possible. My hand hovered near the door handle, ready to bolt if anything moved. But there was nothing. For a long moment, I stood still, listening to the eerie quiet. It was then that I noticed something that hadn't registered before. The shadows. They weren't right. They were deeper than they should have been, like they were moving, creeping along the walls. A shiver ran down my spine, and I instinctively backed away from the door. My foot caught on something, a piece of old wood, maybe a broken chair leg, and I stumbled, falling hard onto the floor. The thud echoed through the cabin, and for a moment, everything felt suspended in time. Then the floorboards creaked, footsteps. I scrambled to my feet, adrenaline surging through me. I didn't care how old the cabin was or how quiet it had seemed before. Someone or something was in here with me. I bolted for the front door, my heart in my throat, but as I reached for the handle, I froze. There, standing in the doorway, was a man. He wasn't old, but there was something about him that didn't sit right. His clothes were worn, like he'd been living rough for years, and his face was pale, hollow-eyed. He didn't speak, just stood there, staring at me with an unsettling calmness. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. My body wouldn't move. My mind raced, but it was like I was trapped in a nightmare, unable to wake up. Then, without a word, he stepped aside, and the air seemed to shift. The weight of something old and terrible filled the cabin, pressing in on me. I knew right then that I wasn't getting out of this place the same way I came in. There was no escaping the past of this cabin, and whatever dark history it held, I had just become a part of it. When I finally stepped outside, the night air felt colder than before. My truck was still parked, but the road seemed longer, more distant than it had just an hour ago. I didn't look back as I drove away. Something told me that if I did, I might see the shadow of the man, still watching me from the dark doorway. But I didn't want to know. Some things are better left forgotten. It was a cold, drizzly evening when I decided to build that cabin. The air was thick with moisture, the kind of rain that doesn't just soak you through but presses down on everything, weighing down the trees, the grass, and the very earth itself. I had been dreaming of this for months. An escape, a place away from everything where I could simply be. No distractions, no one telling me what to do. Just the steady rhythm of the rain and the crackle of firewood. I had chosen a small, secluded piece of land near the edge of the forest, about 3 miles outside of town. It was far enough from civilization to feel remote, but close enough that I could get back if I needed to. The property had been neglected for years, overgrown with weeds and brambles, and the small stream that ran through it had eroded part of the dirt path. But to me, it was perfect. I had the whole summer to work on it, and that was exactly what I needed. A quiet, uninterrupted summer. The first few days of construction went smoothly. I laid the foundation, set the posts, and got the frame up. Each step felt like progress, like I was moving closer to something real. The rain had been a constant companion, but it didn't bother me. It only added to the feeling of isolation, which I liked. The sound of the rain hitting the roof while I worked inside was oddly comforting. It made the cabin feel more secure, more like a fortress. But as the week wore on, the rain didn't stop. It grew heavier, turning the ground into a slippery mess and turning the air thick with mist. By the time I had the walls up, it was hard to see much beyond the clearing where my cabin sat. The trees seemed to disappear into the fog, and everything felt muffled, as though the world itself was underwater. I had been working nonstop, barely stopping to eat or sleep, driven by this restless energy that I couldn't quite explain. I was almost done, just a few finishing touches, and then I could finally enjoy the solitude I had so longed for. But the weather was relentless. The rain turned from a soft drizzle to a torrential downpour, the kind that seems to come straight from the heavens, flooding the world below. By the time I had the roof finished, the ground was a quagmire, and the path leading to the cabin was nearly impassable. That night, I finally finished. I sat on the small wooden porch, my back aching from days of labor, and watched as the rain fell in sheets. It was the perfect night for a fire, but I didn't have a stove set up yet. I hadn't even brought in any firewood. All I had was a lantern, casting a soft yellow glow on the wet wood of the porch and the surrounding forest. It was quiet, so quiet that I could hear the steady rhythm of the rain and the occasional rustle of branches. For a moment, I felt at peace, like the world was holding its breath. But then I heard it, a sound that didn't belong. It was faint at first, almost lost in the rain, but it came again, this time louder, sharper. A crack, a snap, as if someone was walking through the underbrush just beyond the cabin. I sat still, my breath catching in my throat. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the sound. I told myself it was nothing, just the wind or some animal moving through the brush. But the noise came again, closer this time. A sharp, snapping sound of a branch being broken. My heart began to race. There was no wind. There had been no animal tracks near the cabin when I arrived. I was alone, or at least I should have been. I grabbed the lantern, my hand trembling slightly, and stepped off the porch. The light flickered in the heavy rain as I slowly moved toward the edge of the clearing. My boots sank into the mud with each step. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if the very earth was holding something back. I stopped at the edge of the trees, shining the lantern into the shadows, but there was nothing, just darkness and the endless patter of the rain. The sound of the breaking branches stopped. Everything was still again. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it. That is, until I heard it. This time, it was unmistakable. A slow, deliberate drag of something heavy through the wet grass. I froze, my blood running cold. The sound came closer, not from the trees, but from the other side of the clearing, where the dense thicket began. Someone was walking in the rain, dragging something behind them. I wanted to move, to run, but my feet felt rooted to the spot. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the shadows. The drag stopped for a moment, and I heard a faint grunt, followed by a low, guttural sound, like a muffled cough. A shiver ran down my spine. Without thinking, I bolted back toward the cabin, my breath ragged in my chest, the lantern swinging wildly in my hand. I slammed the door shut behind me and bolted it. The house seemed so small now, like it wasn't enough to protect me from whatever was out there. I set the lantern down on the small wooden table and strained my ears to listen, but the rain had picked up again, drowning out all other sounds. I waited in the dark, listening to the rain, trying to control my breathing. But as the minutes ticked by, I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching me. I stared out the small window that faced the clearing. The night was pitch black, but I thought I saw a shape moving at the edge of the trees. A figure, tall and thin, moving slowly, almost methodically, through the rain. It didn't seem to notice me at first, but then it stopped. The figure turned its head, slowly, deliberately, as if it had been waiting for me to notice. I couldn't see its face, just a shadow, but I could feel its eyes on me, even from this distance. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. Without thinking, I reached for the door handle, my mind screaming at me to leave, to get away from whatever this was. But my hand froze inches from the door. I had nowhere to go. The figure began to move toward the cabin, its steps slow and deliberate. It didn't hurry, but it didn't stop either. My pulse quickened, and I backed away from the window, heart hammering in my chest. I glanced around the cabin, searching for something, anything, to defend myself with, but there was nothing. Just walls, windows, and rain. The door rattled, and I jumped back in fear. My breathing was shallow, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The figure outside stopped at the door, and I heard a faint whisper of movement, the soft scrape of something against wood. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the noise stopped. The figure was gone. I waited, motionless, listening to the rain. Minutes passed, and then an hour, but there was no more sound. No more dragging, no more whispers, just the relentless patter of the rain. The morning came eventually, though it felt like it never would. The sun was barely a dull glow through the overcast sky, the air heavy and thick. I gathered what little courage I had left and ventured outside. The ground was slick with water, but there was no sign of the figure. No tracks, no sign of anyone ever being there. I spent the next few hours reinforcing the cabin, checking the locks, and trying to convince myself that it had all been a figment of my imagination. Maybe I had been tired or stressed or simply overwhelmed by the isolation. But deep down, I knew something had been out there, and whatever it was, it hadn't gone far. That day, I packed up and left. The cabin was never finished. I never returned to that patch of land, and I never spoke of what had happened. Some things are better left unspoken, I think. The rain still falls there, I'm sure, but whatever was out there in the woods is still waiting, somewhere, just beyond the trees. The cabin stood in front of me like an old friend, a reminder of everything I had left behind. It had been years since I last stepped foot on this land, but the memories of the place were still vivid in my mind. It was a small, weathered structure nestled in the woods near a quiet lake in northern Michigan, far away from the chaos of the city. I used to visit it with my ex-husband, Lucas, before everything fell apart. The idea of coming back was something I had avoided for years, but now, with my life in a much better place, I needed closure. I had to face it, or else I knew the past would keep haunting me. I parked my car near the edge of the property and took a deep breath. The smell of pine and damp earth flooded my senses, instantly pulling me into the past. The cabin hadn't changed much. The roof was a little more saggy than I remembered, and the wood had darkened from years of rain and snow, but it still had the same charm. It was the kind of place that could make anyone feel isolated, but also strangely peaceful. I grabbed my bag from the passenger seat, the weight of it a physical reminder that I had come here for a reason. This wasn't just a trip for nostalgia. I had unfinished business. I had made the decision to sell the cabin, to let go of what Lucas and I had built here. The idea of it being someone else's now made me uneasy, but it was time. It had to be done. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the familiar sound reminding me of late nights spent with Lucas, the two of us talking about our dreams, our future. I smiled faintly at the thought, but the smile didn't last long. The cabin was eerily quiet, and I could already feel the weight of its history pressing down on me. I set my bag down on the old wooden table in the center of the room. The place was filled with old furniture, mismatched but functional. The couch was still there, the faded fabric with its stains and rips, the same one we used to curl up on. I couldn't help but run my fingers over the armrest. It was so strange to think that I had once felt at home here, that this place had been a refuge. Now it felt foreign. I could hear the wind picking up outside, the trees rustling. It was going to rain soon, the sky already turning a shade of dark gray. The air smelled like impending storms, the heavy humidity pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. It felt like everything in this cabin was waiting for something, waiting for me to finish what I had started years ago. As I moved through the cabin, my eyes fell on the small bedroom at the back. The bed was still made, but the sheets were yellowed with age. The dresser sat against the wall, the wooden drawers slightly askew, as though they had been moved around 100 times. I used to love the view from that window, the way the lake glistened under the sun, how peaceful it looked in the mornings. Now it felt like a trap, a reminder of the time Lucas and I had spent here and all the secrets that came with it. I sat down on the edge of the bed, feeling the rough texture of the mattress beneath me. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to push away the memories of Lucas, of our arguments, the way everything had fallen apart. But the memories wouldn't let me go. They were still there, just beneath the surface, waiting to come back. I heard a soft thud from somewhere outside, followed by a faint rustling. My heart skipped a beat. I immediately stood up and walked to the window, pulling the curtain aside to peer into the dense woods beyond the cabin. The wind howled through the trees, and the rain started falling in heavy sheets, blurring everything. I strained my eyes, searching for any sign of movement, but the woods were empty. I shook my head, laughing nervously at myself. I hadn't been back here in so long. I was probably just imagining things. But as I turned back to the room, something caught my eye on the dresser. A small picture frame, half hidden behind a pile of old books. It was a photo of me and Lucas, taken in the early days of our marriage, before the cracks began to show. I hadn't seen that picture in years. I hadn't even realized it was here. I walked over to it, the coldness in my chest deepening as I stared at our smiling faces. We looked so happy, so in love. I ran my finger over the glass, feeling the dust that had accumulated over the years. And then, something else caught my attention. The picture wasn't in the same frame I remembered. It was different, older. The edges were chipped, the glass cracked, but what stood out the most was the inscription on the back. My hands trembled as I turned it over, reading the words written in familiar handwriting. Asterisk, I'm sorry, it had to end this way. Please forgive me. Asterisk, I froze. Lucas had written this? The words didn't make sense. My chest tightened as I felt my heart race. I couldn't recall ever seeing this note before. Had Lucas known something I didn't? Had he written this before we parted ways? My thoughts were interrupted by another sound. This time, louder, came from outside, and I was certain it was someone walking toward the cabin. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, the kind of sound that made your skin crawl. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag, clicking it on as I approached the door. I had no idea who it could be. I didn't know anyone around here anymore. Not since Lucas left. My thoughts raced, and a sudden chill ran down my spine. Could it be him? Could he have come back? It was impossible, I reminded myself. But then why was someone out there? I carefully opened the door, the cold air and rain pouring in, blurring my vision. I stepped outside cautiously, my flashlight scanning the darkness, but there was no one. No footprints, no signs of movement, just the sound of the storm. My breath came out in short bursts, a mix of confusion and fear. I turned to go back inside when I heard it again. The sound of footsteps. This time they were closer, right behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just the wind howling through the trees. I was losing my mind. It had to be the stress, the isolation. Or maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I slammed the door shut behind me, locking it. I sat in the corner, trying to steady my breathing. The rain hammered against the roof, and the wind screamed through the gaps in the cabin's walls. Felt like the house was alive, breathing with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something that I couldn't see but could feel in every fiber of my being. It wasn't until much later, as the storm finally began to die down, that I noticed something even more unsettling. The picture on the dresser had been moved. It wasn't where I had left it. And on the back, where Lucas's note had once been, there was a new message. Asterisk, you should have never come back. Asterisk, the fear I felt was suffocating. I couldn't stay here anymore. This wasn't just about Lucas. It was something else, something I couldn't explain. I grabbed my things, my mind racing, and left the cabin behind. It was time to say goodbye, for good. It was the early autumn of 2017 when I found myself out in the countryside, far from the nearest town, on a solitary little trip. I wasn't trying to escape anything in particular, but I had been restless lately. The hustle and bustle of city life had taken its toll, and the idea of getting away from everything, even if just for a weekend, was incredibly appealing. I rented a cabin from a small, family-run service. The place was isolated, a good hour's drive from the nearest village, and the drive itself was a journey through narrow, winding roads, flanked by old forests that looked like something out of a horror film. The cabin, sitting at the edge of a desolate graveyard, was an old wooden structure, perhaps a century old, with a sagging roof and peeling paint. The graveyard itself wasn't the typical tourist attraction. It wasn't well kept, and the weathered tombstones were crooked and broken, some of them half buried under moss and ivy. There was something unsettling about the place, but I shrugged it off. I wasn't superstitious, and I figured a graveyard next door was just part of the charm. Besides, the cabin was inexpensive, and it was far enough from civilization to offer the peace I craved. So I didn't think twice about it. The sun had just begun to set when I arrived. The orange glow of dusk cast long shadows over the trees, and the air had a crisp bite to it that told me winter was on its way. I parked my car in front of the cabin, the gravel crunching under the tires. The silence here was overwhelming. No birds, no wind, just the occasional creak of the trees. I grabbed my bag from the trunk and made my way inside. The cabin was musty but comfortable, with old furniture that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. I tossed my things in the corner and went to check out the surroundings. The cabin was small, but it had everything I needed: kitchen, bathroom, a fireplace, and a couple of chairs. I opened the back door and stepped out onto the small porch that faced the graveyard. The graveyard seemed even more eerie now that the last light of day was fading. I could see the headstones scattered across the uneven ground, some of them so weathered that the names had been worn away by time. There were a few trees scattered throughout, their twisted branches reaching into the sky like bony fingers. In the distance, I could make out an old chapel, its stone walls crumbling with age. I shivered despite the warmth of my jacket and closed the door behind me. Inside, I started a fire in the fireplace. The crackling sound of burning wood was the only noise in the cabin, and it created a strangely comforting atmosphere. I made myself some tea, sat back in the chair by the fire, and began to relax. But something felt off. It wasn't the place, it was me. I had this strange, nagging feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't a rational fear, but more of an instinct, like I was being watched. My mind kept returning to the graveyard, and the way the headstones seemed to lean toward the cabin. I tried to shake it off, telling myself that it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. Night fell and the cabin grew darker. I pulled a blanket over myself, settled deeper into the chair, and began reading a book I'd brought along. I'd been reading for maybe an hour when I heard a noise. It was faint at first, almost like a rustle, but then it came again, clearer this time. A soft scraping sound, like someone dragging their feet through the dirt. My heart began to race. I set the book down and listened closely. Nothing, just the wind moving through the trees, or so I told myself. But then the sound came again, closer now, from the graveyard behind the cabin. I stood up, my legs feeling unsteady. Maybe it was an animal, a raccoon or something, but something inside me told me otherwise. I moved toward the window, cautiously peeking out into the darkness. The graveyard was shrouded in shadow, and I couldn't make out much beyond the shapes of the tombstones. But there, standing near one of the larger stones, was a figure. I froze. The figure was tall, impossibly still. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, maybe a tree casting a shadow. But then it shifted, just a little, moving slowly, deliberately, in a way that felt too human to be a tree. I backed away from the window, my pulse quickening. What the hell was going on? There were no streetlights, no neighbors, nothing. I was out here alone, and that figure was standing there, staring at the cabin, or at least I assumed it was. The thought sent a chill down my spine. I didn't know what to do. I thought about leaving, but the car was parked outside, and I wasn't sure if I'd even make it to the road. The graveyard wasn't far from the cabin, and whatever that figure was, it could be close enough to see me. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. Of course, there wouldn't be. The cabin was way off the grid. My mind raced through possibilities. Maybe it was a local, someone who had wandered out to the graveyard for a late-night walk. But the figure didn't seem like someone out for a stroll. It was too still, too deliberate. The sound of scraping continued, now coming closer to the cabin. I could hear footsteps crunching on the gravel outside, slow and heavy, like someone was dragging their feet. I moved away from the window, heart pounding in my chest, and went to the front door, locking it quickly. I checked all the windows, making sure they were secure, and then I retreated into the farthest corner of the cabin. Time passed slowly. The scraping stopped. The footsteps, too, faded away. But my anxiety didn't let up. I spent the rest of the night with my back pressed against the wall, eyes glued to the door, listening for any sound that might signal danger. But the silence stretched on, and by morning, I was exhausted, my mind teetering on the edge of panic. When the sun finally rose, I was too afraid to leave. I hadn't slept a wink, but the light outside felt like a safety net. I stepped cautiously onto the porch, peering out toward the graveyard. The figure was gone, and everything seemed normal. The headstones were still crooked, the trees still swayed in the breeze, but there was no sign of whatever I had seen the night before. I walked toward the graveyard, my boots crunching on the frost-covered grass. The ground was damp, and the air had that early morning chill that bit at your skin. As I approached the spot where I had seen the figure, I noticed something strange. There, by one of the oldest tombstones, was a fresh set of footprints. Large, heavy, as though someone had been standing there for hours, only to leave once the sun began to rise. I turned and quickly walked back to the cabin. My steps hurried, my heart racing. It wasn't just the figure that scared me. It was the feeling that someone, had been watching me the whole time, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. I left that morning, not looking back as I drove away from the cabin. I never found out who or what was out there that night, and maybe it was better that way. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been trespassing on something that wasn't mine. The graveyard, the cabin, the land, whatever it was, it didn't want me there. And in the end, I wasn't sure if I had ever truly been alone. I never thought I would find myself alone in that cabin, but here I was. The air outside had taken a chill, the kind that seeps into your bones and makes your fingers ache. I had driven down to the cabin for a reason, a sad one. My grandmother had passed away a week ago, and though I had seen her deteriorate over the years, the finality of it still hit me like a punch in the gut. I wasn't even sure why I was here. Maybe it was to sort through her things, maybe to say goodbye, or maybe to find some kind of closure. The cabin sat at the edge of a small, forgotten town, somewhere deep in the mountains, far enough from civilization that people rarely came around. Grandma had always lived here alone. She liked it that way, said the quiet was her peace, and the occasional visit from the neighbors was enough socializing for her. The cabin had been in our family for generations. Every corner of it smelled like her, with smoke, old books, and the faintest trace of lavender. I hadn't been here in years, but it still felt the same. I parked my car at the edge of the gravel driveway, the crunch of the tires the only sound around me. The trees loomed tall and quiet, casting long shadows over the cabin. I could feel the weight of the silence pressing on me, but I pushed through it. It was just a house after all. A house with a lot of memories, some good, some bad. The front door creaked open, the hinges stiff from years of neglect. The first thing that hit me was the smell. It wasn't the comforting scent I remembered. Instead, it was damp and musty, a strange mixture of mold and the faintest hint of something rotten. I didn't want to think about it too much, but it gnawed at the back of my mind. I stepped inside, my boots making an echo on the wooden floors. Dust had settled everywhere. The walls were lined with photographs, some faded, some still sharp, capturing moments from Grandma's life. I ran my hand over a frame of her as a young woman, standing proud and strong in front of the cabin. She had lived a full life, but it didn't feel like it had been enough. I didn't feel ready to say goodbye. I set my bag down near the door and walked further into the house. The living room was just as I remembered it. A worn-out couch, a heavy stone fireplace, and a large rug that had seen better days. But the further I walked into the house, the more unsettling it felt. It was too quiet. Not the kind of peaceful quiet, but the kind that made your skin crawl. My footsteps led me toward the back of the house, where Grandma's room was. The door was slightly ajar. My heart started to race, an unease building in my chest. I wasn't sure what I was expecting. Maybe a sign of her, some trace of her presence. But as I pushed the door open, my breath hitched in my throat. There, in the middle of the room, was the bed. The faded quilts and pillows lay undisturbed. But it was the figure lying in the bed that stopped me cold. Grandma's body. I hadn't been prepared for this. I thought I'd be able to handle it, to walk in and maybe feel some kind of peace. But instead, I froze. Her face was pale, the skin sunken, and the faintest hint of rigor mortis had already set in. I had seen death before, both in the hospital and in the morgue, but this was different. Felt too real, too close. The air in the room felt heavy, like the walls were closing in. Her body was there, but it didn't seem like her anymore. I remembered the way she used to sit in her rocking chair by the window, telling me stories and watching the birds outside. But now, lying there, her hands folded neatly over her chest, she was just a shell. She was gone. I stood there for a long time, my thoughts racing. I didn't know what to do. I had expected to go through some old boxes or clean out the cabin, but not this. Not her body still in the room. I looked around, trying to make sense of it. The window was open just a crack, and a cold breeze rustled the curtains. It made me shiver. There were no signs of anything out of the ordinary, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I left the room, my mind spinning, my stomach in knots. I went back into the living room, pacing in circles, trying to steady my breathing. That's when I heard it. A faint sound like something shifting. I froze. My eyes snapped to the hallway leading to the back of the house. I had just come from there, the room where Grandma's body lay. I could still hear it, a soft rustling, like clothes brushing against each other. I was so tense I thought my muscles might snap. My heart was pounding, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. I knew I should leave. That feeling, that sense of something wrong, was growing stronger. But my feet wouldn't move. It was like my body was paralyzed by fear. I glanced toward the window, my mind racing. The sun was starting to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the room. The light was fading, and I knew it would be dark soon. I didn't want to be here when the darkness took over. The sound came again. This time it was louder, a scrape. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I stood up, my legs shaking beneath me, and walked slowly toward the back hallway. The closer I got, the more I could feel my chest tightening. I reached the door to Grandma's room and hesitated. The sound had stopped, but there was a thick, oppressive stillness in the air. I opened the door. Nothing had changed. Grandma's body was still lying there, just as it had been before. But something else caught my eye. On the floor beside the bed, a book lay open. The pages were yellowed with age, the leather cover cracked. I didn't remember seeing it there before. I picked it up, my hands trembling, and flipped through the pages. It was a journal filled with handwritten notes. The writing was small, neat, and oddly familiar. I couldn't place it at first, but then I recognized the handwriting. It was Grandma's. I read the first few lines aloud, but my voice caught in my throat. The words were chilling. Asterisk. I can hear it in the walls now. I hear it scratching and scraping, and sometimes it whispers. I know it's not just me. I know someone else is here. Asterisk. I dropped the journal, the weight of those words sinking into my bones. My body felt cold, as though the very air around me had turned to ice. The scratching noise came again, but this time it wasn't in the walls. It was coming from inside the room. I bolted out of the cabin. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, heart hammering in my chest. The journal was still in my hand. I had to get out of there. I didn't go back to the cabin for years after that night. I never could shake the feeling that Grandma hadn't died in peace, that something had been with her in that room, waiting, and I don't know what it was. But I know one thing for sure: I never want to find out. It was a late autumn evening when I first arrived at the ranger cabin tucked deep in the woods of Raven Hill National Park. I was only 24 years old, and I had just finished my seasonal training as a park ranger. This cabin, isolated and surrounded by towering pines and thick forest, was meant to be my home for the next 6 months. It wasn't exactly the kind of place most people would choose to spend winter, but the job had its appeal. There was something undeniably tranquil about the idea of being in the woods, away from the noise and busyness of the world. Plus, I was excited to prove myself. The cabin was small but solid, built from heavy logs that gave it a rustic, weathered charm. It sat at the edge of a narrow dirt road that wound its way through the park, which meant I was more or less cut off from the outside world. The nearest town was a good 30 miles away, and the next ranger station was even farther. The isolation was part of the appeal, but it came with its own sense of quiet unease. I had arrived just after sunset, and as the darkness crept in, the trees cast long, skeletal shadows across the land. The air was thick with the smell of pine and damp earth. There was a chill in the wind, and the leaves had already started to fall, carpeting the ground in shades of orange and brown. I felt a slight shiver run through me as I unloaded my gear and made my way inside. The cabin was surprisingly warm for its age. There was a wood-burning stove in the center of the main room, a small kitchen area with a simple stove and sink, and a modest bedroom in the back. A stack of firewood had been left by the door, and I immediately set to work building a fire to keep the chill at bay. The crackling flames were comforting, and after a long day of driving, I felt my body finally start to relax. I spent the first few hours settling in. I unpacked my things, organized the small pantry, and went through the basic equipment left behind by the previous ranger. The forest around the cabin felt alive with the sounds of rustling leaves and the occasional snap of a twig. It was easy to forget that, out here, things weren't always as peaceful as they seemed. Around 10 p.m., I decided to go for a walk around the perimeter of the cabin to get a feel for my new surroundings. The moon was barely visible through the thick canopy, and the only light came from the dim glow of the cabin windows. The wind had picked up, making the trees creak and groan in the darkness. There was something unnerving about the stillness, the way the forest seemed to hold its breath. I brushed it off as first-day jitters. I walked the dirt trail that circled the cabin, my boots crunching on the gravel and leaves. There was a sharp, bitter cold in the air that made my breath puff in small clouds in front of me. As I rounded the corner of the cabin, I spotted something odd. A figure, person, standing motionless about 30 yards away, just on the edge of the tree line. For a moment, I froze, unsure of what I was seeing. It was a man, tall and hunched over slightly, wearing a heavy jacket and boots. His face was obscured by the shadows, but something about the way he stood felt wrong. Like he wasn't just standing still out of choice, but because he didn't quite belong there. I called out, "Hey, you lost or something?" No answer. I took a step forward, trying to make out more of his features, but he didn't move. The wind had died down, leaving behind a strange quietness. I called out again, louder this time, but still nothing. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. Instinct told me something wasn't right. Maybe it was a hunter or a camper who had wandered off the trail. But as I stood there, the man's lack of movement unnerved me. It was as if he were waiting, watching, but not doing anything. After what felt like an eternity, I turned to go back inside, ready to forget the whole thing. But when I glanced over my shoulder, the figure was gone. Not in the way a person would move, but like they had evaporated into thin air. 1 second he was standing there, and the next he was completely gone. I wasn't sure if I had imagined the whole thing, but the unease stayed with me as I made my way back inside the cabin. I locked the door behind me, piled more wood into the stove, and sat down at the small table. My heart was still racing, but I told myself it was just the isolation getting to me. I had read enough stories about rangers losing their grip on reality after being alone for too long. I spent the next hour reading through the logbook left by the previous ranger. Most of it was mundane, weather reports, animal sightings, and the occasional minor incident. But one entry caught my eye. It was from only a few days before I arrived. It was written in a hurried, almost panicked scrawl. Asterisk, stay away from the woods after dark. Don't go near the old trail. It's not safe. Something's out there. I've seen it. I've heard it. It watches. Don't say I didn't warn you. Asterisk, the words sent a shiver down my spine. I tried to dismiss it as nothing more than paranoia, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this place than I understood. The next few days were quiet, but I couldn't stop thinking about that figure I'd seen. I kept a watchful eye on the woods, walking the trails during the day, making sure everything was in order. But every time the sun began to dip below the horizon, an unsettling feeling crept into my chest. I would close the blinds, lock the doors, and sit by the fire, trying to keep my mind busy. One afternoon, as I was out on patrol, I found something that made my blood run cold. A set of footprints, fresh, deep imprints in the soft earth, leading from the tree line toward the cabin. They were big, too big to be from any normal person, and they didn't look like the tracks of a hunter or hiker. They were odd, almost too heavy, as if the person had been dragging something behind them. The footprints ended right at the edge of the cabin, then abruptly stopped. No sign of anyone having turned around or continued on. It was like they had vanished, just like the man. That night, as I sat in the cabin, the wind howled outside, shaking the walls. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. The unease had grown into full-blown fear, and I realized that no amount of logic or training could explain what was happening. The next morning, I packed up my things and left the cabin. I wasn't sure what was out there, but I knew one thing for sure. It wasn't something I could handle alone. As I drove away, the trees seemed to close in behind me, as if the forest had been waiting for me to leave. I never went back to Raven Hill. Some places are better left unexplored, and some things are better left forgotten. The woods still call to me in my dreams, but I know better than to listen. It was the summer of 2017, and I was 28 years old. After a long stretch of city life, I needed a break, something to get away from the noise, the constant rush, and the suffocating energy of urban living. So, I rented a small, isolated cabin in the high desert of New Mexico. The cabin was tucked away in a quiet part of the land, near an old dirt road that hardly anyone used. It was supposed to be a quiet retreat, just me and my dog, Max, a big German shepherd. I figured it would be a good opportunity to get some peace, read, and just reset my mind. The cabin was everything I wanted. It had wooden beams that creaked when the wind blew through the trees, a fireplace for the cool nights, and large windows that let in the sun. There was no electricity, just a gas stove, an oil lantern, and a fireplace for heat. I was fine with that. In fact, it added to the charm. The isolation was peaceful, but there was an eerie quality to the silence that kept gnawing at the edges of my comfort. On the second day, I went for a hike with Max. The landscape around the cabin was vast, endless stretches of desert with small patches of scraggly bushes and rocks scattered here and there. It was quiet, so quiet that the wind sounded like whispers in the distance. Max, as usual, was alert, sniffing around, his ears twitching at every sound. I thought it was a little odd that he was so restless, but I just brushed it off as him being an overprotective dog. I hadn't realized how far we'd walked until I started seeing old, decaying fence posts. The further we went, the more abandoned this place felt, like nature was trying to reclaim it, and I was intruding on something forgotten. We reached the edge of a small grove of twisted trees when Max started growling low, the hairs on his neck standing up. I tried to calm him down, but the growl grew louder, more intense. He didn't budge, standing firm like a sentinel. My heart began to pound. I looked around, but there was nothing. No animals, no movement, just the wind and the dry desert stretching out in every direction. Then I heard it, a sound, faint at first but growing louder with each passing second. It wasn't the wind, and it definitely wasn't an animal. It was the sound of something walking, something heavy. My breath caught in my throat, and I could feel the blood draining from my face. Max's growl turned into a bark, sharp and alert. "Max, stop it!" I hissed, trying to pull him away, but he refused to move, fixated on something just beyond the trees. Then I saw it, a figure, tall and hunched over, stepping slowly into view. It moved with a strange, unnatural gait, like it didn't belong to a human at all. It wasn't a person, at least not in the way I understood people. The figure was wearing tattered clothes, but they were stretched over a form that was too thin, too elongated. The face, that's what froze me in place. It wasn't a human face, not entirely. The eyes were too wide, too dark, and the skin was stretched tight over its skull, a pale, sickly color. It had long fingers, each one too long for a human hand, reaching out like claws. Max lunged forward, barking wildly, but the figure didn't flinch. Instead, it turned its head slowly to look at me, and I saw its mouth, wide and unnaturally stretched, like it was trying to smile, but it wasn't right. It wasn't a smile, it was something twisted. I grabbed Max's leash, pulling him back, my heart hammering in my chest. But as I turned to run, I heard the sound of footsteps following behind me, slow and deliberate. My legs moved before my brain could process what was happening. I glanced over my shoulder, and the figure was still there, walking, its pace never increasing, yet somehow gaining on me. I broke into a full sprint, Max pulling against me, his bark echoing through the trees. The ground beneath me felt unstable, the desert dirt soft and loose, but I didn't stop, not even when I felt the dry air burning in my lungs. I kept running, my mind screaming at me to get back to the cabin, to safety. Somehow, I managed to make it back to the cabin. My heart was still racing as I slammed the door shut behind me, panting for breath. Max was already at the window, still growling, his eyes wide with fear. I peeked outside, but there was nothing there, just the empty, silent desert. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed up, the oil lantern casting strange shadows on the walls. Max lay at my feet, occasionally whining, his eyes darting around the cabin as if he could feel something I couldn't. I kept thinking I heard something moving outside, footsteps, but every time I looked, the desert was still, the sky dark and endless. The next morning, I woke up with the sun rising over the horizon, painting the land in soft orange hues. It seemed like nothing had happened, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, something I couldn't explain. Max, who had been on edge for most of the morning, finally seemed to relax around noon. I thought maybe it was over, maybe I had just imagined the whole thing. But then, in the early afternoon, I saw something that made my blood run cold. I was outside, sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee, when I noticed a figure standing near the tree line. It was standing perfectly still, just like the night before. At first, I thought it was a person, but as I looked closer, I saw it again. The way it was hunched over, its head tilted in that unnatural angle, its eyes glistening like black marbles in the sun. I slammed the door and locked it, my mind racing. Couldn't just leave. Max and I were too far from civilization. I had to survive. As night fell, the air grew colder, and I felt the presence again. It was close. I could hear it walking around the cabin, its footsteps slow but constant, just beyond the walls. I tried to keep calm, but every little sound made my skin crawl. I couldn't tell if I was imagining it or if it was truly out there. I knew one thing for sure. I was trapped. The figure didn't come inside. It never did. But it stayed close, circling, lurking, watching. I spent the night awake, gripping Max's leash tightly in my hands. The fear gnawed at me until morning. When the sun rose, I grabbed my stuff, packed up as quickly as I could, and left. I didn't look back. As I drove away, the cabin growing smaller in my rearview mirror, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was had been watching me. I knew I'd never come back, but I also knew, deep down, that I wasn't the only one who had seen it, and I wasn't the only one it was hunting. Max never fully relaxed after that trip. Even back home, he'd often stand at the window, staring out into the distance, his ears twitching at every sound. I don't think he ever forgot whatever it was we saw out there. Neither did I. I didn't expect much when I booked the cabin in the middle of nowhere. It seemed like a perfect escape, a quiet, isolated place to recharge. The location was in the Yorkshire Dales, deep in the hills, far away from the bustling streets of London. I'd been dealing with a lot of stress lately, and this cabin was supposed to be a peaceful retreat. It wasn't until I got there that I realized how wrong I was. The cabin was small but cozy, nestled at the edge of a forest, surrounded by trees that seemed to stretch on forever. It had an old stone chimney and a wooden front porch with a couple of mismatched chairs. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the wind howled softly through the trees. I could barely hear anything else, just the constant rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of birds. It was remote, and I liked that. It felt like I was alone in the world. I arrived just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows over the ground. The warm glow of the cabin's small, glowing windows made it look inviting. Inside, it was exactly as described, simple and rustic. A small kitchen, a worn-out leather couch, a wood-burning stove, and a large window that looked out into the forest. The floorboards creaked as I moved around, and there was an odd smell, like old wood and something faintly metallic, but I pushed it aside. The cabin was exactly what I needed. I unpacked my things, set up my spot on the couch, and cracked open a book. As the darkness set in, I felt a sense of calm. The noise from the outside world seemed so far away. It was just me and the woods. But as night fell, something started to feel off. First, it was the silence. The usual sounds of nature, crickets chirping, owls hooting, seemed to disappear. I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was just the weather. It had been a rainy day, and the wind was picking up again, rattling the windows. I was trying to shake off the uneasy feeling when I heard something. A soft scratching sound at the front door. My heart jumped, and I got up to check, thinking maybe a bird or a branch had brushed against it. But when I looked through the peephole, I didn't see anything. The darkness outside seemed to stretch on forever, empty. I shrugged it off, but a nagging feeling kept me on edge. I locked the door and returned to the couch, but sleep wouldn't come. The wind howled louder now, and the occasional creak of the cabin's old frame didn't help. I checked the time. It was already past midnight. That's when I saw her. At first, it was just a figure in the distance, moving between the trees. She was tall, wearing a long, tattered coat that dragged on the ground. Her hair was wild, unkempt, and flowed around her face, but it was hard to make out any more details. I froze, staring, unsure of what I was seeing. She moved slowly, like she was walking toward the cabin. I rubbed my eyes, thinking I was just seeing things. But when I looked again, she was still there, standing a little closer, just outside the reach of the porch light. The scratching sound returned, louder this time. It came from the door, sharp and deliberate. I rushed to the window, trying to get a better look, but the woman had vanished into the darkness. I didn't know if she was real or if my mind was playing tricks on me. My hands were shaking. I told myself to calm down. It was probably just a local, someone who lived nearby, wandering out in the dark. There was no reason to panic. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The air felt heavier, the wind colder. I grabbed my phone to check for any service, but there was none. No signal, no connection. Of course, I thought, typical. No one could find me here if anything went wrong. I decided to lock all the doors and windows and just go to bed. It seemed like the safest thing to do, even though I didn't feel safe at all. I turned off the lights, pulled the blanket over my head, and tried to ignore the odd noises coming from outside. But I couldn't sleep. The wind continued to rage outside, but I was more focused on the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every small creak, every rustle of leaves, made my heart race. It felt like the woods were alive, pressing in on me from all sides. I tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. Then came the knock. Light, soft but distinct. Came from the back door this time. I grabbed the flashlight from the bedside table and crept to the back window. The beam cut through the darkness, and there, standing in the garden, was the woman again. She wasn't just standing anymore. She was staring directly at the cabin, her face partially obscured by her wild hair, but her eyes, those eyes, were wide open, fixed on me. They were dark, nearly black, and empty. I felt an ice-cold shiver run down my spine. I stepped back from the window, trying not to make any noise. My heart was pounding in my chest, each beat so loud I thought it would give me away. I turned off the flashlight, plunging the room back into darkness, but I couldn't shake the image of her standing out there, unmoving, staring. The knock came again, this time louder, more insistent. I couldn't stay in the cabin any longer. I grabbed my things, slipped on my boots, and headed for the front door. But before I could reach it, I heard the unmistakable sound of someone, scraping at the wood, the same scratching noise I'd heard before. It was right behind me, coming from the door. I froze. I didn't dare open it. Instead, I rushed to the back door, the one that led out into the yard. My hands were trembling as I turned the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The door was locked. I ran to the kitchen, looking for anything that could help. I was frantic now, feeling trapped. I grabbed the knife from the counter and held it in front of me like a weapon, but it felt useless. What could I do? The woman was outside, and I didn't know if she was alone. Suddenly, I heard a loud thud, followed by another scraping sound, this time on the kitchen window. I jumped, turning to face the glass. There, pressed against the window, was the woman's face, twisted, grimacing, her nose flat against the glass. I backed away, my heart in my throat. It was like she was trying to get in, to reach me. The eyes, those dark, soulless eyes, were still staring. I couldn't take it anymore. I ran to the front door and flung it open. The cold night air hit me like a punch to the face. I stumbled down the stairs, not even bothering to look back. I just ran blindly into the woods. I didn't stop until I reached the road. The cabin, the woman, everything felt like a nightmare. I didn't look back, even when I heard the crunch of footsteps behind me. It wasn't until I reached the nearest village that I collapsed, gasping for breath. I never went back to that cabin, and I never got the chance to find out who that woman was or why she was there. Maybe it was all just a product of my tired mind, but the memory of her face, pressed against that window, still haunts me. I've never been a fan of the countryside. I don't know if it's the quiet or the isolation, but something about it always gave me the creeps. Maybe it was because I grew up in the city, where the sounds of life were constant. But when I got the chance to take a break from work, I figured a weekend away from it all could be good for my mental health. I had never been to this particular area before, a small farming community nestled in the heart of Missouri, but it seemed peaceful enough from the photos. The cabin was a little more rustic than I had imagined, but it was exactly what I needed to disconnect. There was no Wi-Fi, no phone signal, just trees, fields, and the occasional rustle of animals nearby. I had the place to myself, which at first was a relief. My dog, Duke, came along too, and we quickly settled in. It felt good to breathe in the fresh air and hear the sounds of the forest around me, a sharp contrast to the traffic and noise back home. On the first night, after I had unloaded the car and cleaned up a bit, I sat out on the porch, listening to the crickets and watching the stars. Duke, who had been restless since we arrived, lay down beside me, his head on my lap. The breeze was cool, and the moon was almost full, casting a soft light across the fields. Everything felt calm, almost too calm. Around 10:30 p.m., I noticed something odd. There was a light way off in the distance. It wasn't a flashlight or a car because it was stationary and flickering, almost like a fire, but too far for me to be sure. I wasn't particularly worried at first, but the more I stared at it, the more it bothered me. I kept telling myself it was just a distant farm or something, but then the wind picked up, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I told myself it was nothing. A few minutes passed, and the light went out. I relaxed a little, but then Duke started growling softly. His eyes locked on the woods. His ears were back, and he was watching something intently. At first, I thought it was just a deer or some other animal, but his growl deepened, and he started pacing back and forth. That's when I heard it. A noise, faint at first, like something scraping against the ground. I strained to hear it over the rustling of the trees, but the noise seemed to grow louder. It was like something was dragging itself along the dirt. My heart started to race. Duke's growl turned into a low, guttural bark. He was tense, his body shaking. I quickly grabbed a flashlight and scanned the woods, but all I could see were the shadows of the trees, their branches swaying in the wind. The noise stopped, but Duke wouldn't stop barking. I tried to calm him down, but he wasn't having it. There was something in the woods. I knew it. I decided to go inside. I locked all the doors and closed the blinds, trying to shake off the feeling of unease that had settled in my chest. But Duke didn't calm down. He paced around the cabin, whining and barking at the windows. I tried to make him lie down, but he wasn't having any of it. His eyes were wide, and his tail was tucked between his legs. Around midnight, I heard it again, the dragging sound. It was closer now, so close that it felt like it was just outside the door. I froze. The only sound was Duke's frantic barking and the wind rustling the trees. I grabbed the rifle from the closet and loaded it, just in case. There wasn't much else I could do. I checked all the windows again, but everything seemed normal. The moonlight spilled over the yard, casting shadows that played tricks on my eyes. I could hear Duke breathing heavily beside me, but he wasn't barking anymore. Then, just as quickly as it started, the noise stopped. The woods went eerily silent. I tried to convince myself that it was just some animal, maybe a bear or a wild boar, but it didn't feel right. Duke had never acted like this before. I thought about calling the authorities, but I didn't have any signal, and honestly, I wasn't sure what I'd say. Hey, I'm at a cabin and something's outside? They'd think I was crazy. The night dragged on and I barely slept. Every little noise made me jump. I kept the lights off, afraid that if I shone them outside, I'd see something I wasn't supposed to. At one point, I heard something tapping against the side of the cabin, like someone was knocking on the walls, but when I looked, there was no one there. I could feel eyes on me watching from the dark, but I couldn't see a thing. By morning, I was exhausted and on edge. The sun had risen, but the forest still felt oppressive. I figured I'd pack up and leave early, but before I could do that, I had to take care of Duke. He hadn't eaten or drunk anything all night, and I knew something was seriously wrong. He wouldn't stop pacing and whining. The minute I stepped outside to take him for a walk, I felt a chill, even though it was a warm day. It wasn't the kind of chill you get from cold weather, it was the kind that comes from fear. I started walking towards the woods, with Duke pulling at the leash, his eyes wide with panic. I didn't know why, but something compelled me to walk deeper into the trees. I wasn't thinking straight. The dragging sound from last night echoed in my mind, but it wasn't until I reached a clearing that I understood why. There, in the middle of the clearing, was a pile of old farm tools. It didn't make sense. The tools were all rusted, old, and abandoned, but what struck me was the strange arrangement. It looked almost like someone had been building something, a trap or a barricade, but I couldn't tell what. The odd thing was that there was blood on the tools, fresh blood. I froze. My first thought was that it had to be an animal, but then I saw something in the distance, movement at the edge of the clearing. Something tall, walking on two legs, but its movement was jerky, unnatural. My heart skipped a beat. Duke started to bark violently, and I felt a surge of adrenaline. I turned to run, but before I could get very far, I heard the noise again, the dragging sound, closer this time. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear the heavy breathing behind me. Duke was pulling hard, trying to drag me faster, but I could feel something in the air, something watching us. When we made it back to the cabin, I slammed the door shut and locked it. The air was thick with fear. I didn't know what I had just seen, but I knew it wasn't human. There was something out there, something that shouldn't be. I spent the rest of the day sitting in the cabin, too scared to leave. As dusk fell, I decided it was time to leave. I couldn't stay another night, not with whatever was out there. I packed my things, loaded up the car, and drove off, not daring to look back. I still don't know what it was. Maybe it was a person, or maybe it was something else entirely. All I know is that I'll never go back to that cabin. The memory of those eyes, the sound of something dragging itself in the woods, will stay with me forever. The sun had barely set as I pulled up to the old hunting cabin, my tires crunching the gravel underfoot. It had been a long, tiring drive to get here, nearly 5 hours from the nearest town. The cabin sat at the edge of a thick pine forest, far from the nearest road, and with nothing but wilderness for miles. I wasn't here for a vacation or some kind of retreat. I was here to hunt. I wasn't new to this. Growing up, my dad took me on hunting trips, and I'd spent plenty of time in the woods. But something about this place felt different. The trees seemed a little taller, their trunks thicker. The air felt cooler even for October. Maybe it was because I hadn't been here in years, or maybe it was the fact that I was alone. Whatever it was, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease crawling up my spine. The cabin itself was a small, weather-beaten structure with a sagging porch. The wooden steps creaked as I made my way to the door. I could feel my boots digging into the soft dirt with each step, and I found myself hesitating at the threshold. It wasn't the first time I'd been alone in a cabin like this, but something about the silence here felt off. The wind rustled the trees, and I could hear the faint hoot of an owl in the distance. But there was no hum of insects, no sound of small creatures skittering in the underbrush. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just nerves. I grabbed my duffel bag and rifle, kicking the door open with a bit more force than I intended. The inside of the cabin was dim, the only light coming from the small, dirty windows. Dust danced in the air, disturbed by my entrance. The smell of stale wood and something else, something faintly rancid, hit me like a punch to the gut. I dropped my bag by the door and scanned the room. A fireplace sat in the far corner, the blackened stones still holding the remains of a fire long since burnt out. There were 2 chairs by the hearth, both looking like they'd seen better days. A wooden table stood against one wall, its surface scarred and chipped. A single bunk bed, unmade and abandoned, sat opposite the fireplace. The whole place had a forgotten feel to it, like it hadn't been lived in for years. But that didn't make sense. This cabin was supposed to be in use, rented out to hunters and travelers, a simple place to crash after a long day in the woods. I tried to shake off the discomfort, setting my rifle on the table and unpacking my gear. It wasn't until I went to fill the kettle with water from the pump outside that I noticed the first sign that something was wrong. The pump handle creaked loudly as I pulled it, but no water came out. I pulled again, this time harder, until the handle gave a loud snap, and I was left holding the broken metal. I swore under my breath and tossed it aside. There was a small creek not far off, so I decided to grab water from there instead. When I returned, the air had grown colder. I chalked it up to the evening settling in, but it still felt strange. The wind had picked up, howling through the trees, rattling the windows. I noticed a few pine cones scattered around the porch. They hadn't been there earlier, I was sure of it. Inside, I lit a fire in the stove, the crackling flames offering some warmth as I began to prepare a simple meal. I was no gourmet chef, but I had enough skills to get by. As I ate, I tried to push down the uneasy feeling gnawing at me. It was nothing, just a bit of nervous energy. But then, around midnight, it happened. I had just finished cleaning up the dishes when I heard something outside. At first, I thought it was the wind, branches scraping against the cabin, leaves rustling. But then I heard it again, a slow, deliberate thud. It came from the woods, maybe 30 yards out, near the tree line. I froze. My hand went instinctively to my rifle. It was probably an animal, deer, maybe a bear. I'd heard stories of black bears wandering near hunting cabins, especially in the fall when food was scarce. But this felt different. The thud was too deliberate, too rhythmic. I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was out there, watching. I waited, holding my breath, trying to listen for any more sounds. The minutes stretched on in silence. Then I heard it again. The thud was closer now. It sounded like footsteps, heavy ones. I grabbed my flashlight, my heart pounding. My instincts told me to head outside and check, but a deep, gnawing fear kept me rooted in place. I slowly made my way to the window, peeking through the dusty curtains. Nothing. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding and went back to my seat. But the feeling didn't fade. Something was wrong, and I couldn't explain it. I stayed up the rest of the night, rifle in hand, watching the darkened doorway, half expecting it to burst open at any moment. But nothing happened. The noise stopped. The air went still. I didn't sleep a wink that night. The morning came and I was exhausted, but the sun's first light gave me some relief. I packed my gear, determined to get out of the cabin and return to the relative safety of the town. I didn't even care about hunting anymore. I just needed to leave. But as I stepped outside, I noticed something in the dirt near the door. A set of large footprints, fresh in the soft earth. They were too big to be human. They were too deep, like something heavier had pressed into the ground. I followed the trail, hoping to find an explanation, maybe an animal. But as I walked deeper into the woods, I found something else. Something I hadn't expected. There, about 30 feet away from the cabin, was a small pile of what looked like old animal bones. Not just any bones. These were picked clean, their edges worn smooth, as if they'd been gnawed on for years. And in the center of the pile was something that made my blood run cold. A torn piece of clothing. It was an old, faded shirt, covered in dirt and bloodstains. I recognized it immediately. It was mine. The realization hit me like a punch to the stomach. This wasn't an animal. Whoever or whatever was out here had been watching me. They'd been waiting for me to make the first move. I turned and ran back to the cabin, my breath ragged in my chest. I couldn't get out fast enough. The woods felt like they were closing in on me, the trees growing darker, the shadows lengthening with every step. By the time I reached my truck, the sun had fully risen, casting an eerie glow over the clearing. I didn't look back. I just drove. I never went back to that cabin. No one ever explained the strange occurrences I experienced there. I've heard rumors since, about people disappearing in the woods, about a strange presence that haunts the area. But whatever it was, I know one thing for sure. I got lucky that night. The woods are not to be trusted, and neither, I fear, is the quiet that surrounds them. It was the fall of 2017 when I decided to take a break from city life and go to a cabin in the woods. I was 28 at the time, tired of the constant noise and the suffocating pace of my office job. So, when I found a tiny, secluded cabin nestled in the forest near a small town in the Pacific Northwest, it felt like the perfect escape. The cabin was old, built in the 60s, with dark, weathered wood that had been softened by years of rain. The surrounding trees were massive, their branches reaching out like fingers, making the sunlight barely pierce through. The smell of pine was thick in the air, and the ground beneath my feet was spongy from years of fallen needles. It had all the charm I needed to unwind, or so I thought. I arrived on a Friday afternoon, the sky gray with the promise of rain. The first thing that struck me about the place was how quiet it was. The kind of silence you only find in the deep woods, where the only sounds are the occasional bird call or the rustling of leaves in the wind. I unpacked my bags, settled into the old leather armchair by the stone fireplace, and felt a sense of peace wash over me. The only noise was the crackling of the fire. But as the evening approached, something felt off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. The cabin was cozy, and I had everything I needed: books, a record player, a small kitchen to cook whatever I wanted. But I kept hearing things. A soft creak from the ceiling, the sound of a footstep on the porch, or the whisper of the wind, but not in a comforting way, more like something was trying to get in. I shook it off. It was just my nerves. After all, I hadn't been alone in a cabin in the woods before. I lit some candles, put on a record, and decided to get comfortable. As the night deepened, so did the unease. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, and the rain began to beat against the roof. At one point, I stood up to stoke the fire, but as I did, I saw something outside the window, just a flicker of movement, a shadow. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a bear, but it didn't make sense. The way it moved, like it was walking on two legs, but not quite like a person. It was too fast, too fluid. My heart skipped a beat. I stood there, staring at the window, waiting for the figure to reappear. But it didn't. The shadow was gone, leaving only the darkened woods and the heavy rain. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was nothing, just a trick of the light or the storm playing with my eyes. The night dragged on and I finally went to bed, but sleep didn't come easy. Every little noise, every crack, every rustle kept me on edge. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke up to the sound of scratching at the window. It was a soft, rhythmic sound, like something was gently tapping the glass with its claws. My heart pounded. I knew I wasn't imagining it. I could hear it clearly, scratching, scraping, almost like it was deliberate. I forced myself to get out of bed. I grabbed a flashlight and went to the window, shining the beam into the night. Nothing. I scanned the darkness, my breath fogging up the glass. But there was no sign of anything outside. No animal, no figure, just the rain, relentless and steady. I was beginning to wonder if the isolation was starting to mess with my head. The silence was overwhelming, and the cabin itself felt almost alive. The wood creaked as if it were settling into itself, and the fire crackled in a way that seemed to echo through the cabin, unnervingly loud. The next morning, I went out to the porch to clear my head. The woods were damp, the ground soft and mucky from the overnight rain. I noticed something strange, something that made my stomach twist. There were footprints, huge, deep impressions in the mud, leading up to the cabin. They were too large to be from any animal I recognized, and the shape was wrong. Too wide, too long. The prints seemed to stop right at the door. I froze. The back of my neck prickled, and I suddenly had the urge to run. But I didn't. I went back inside and locked the door, my mind racing with possibilities. Maybe it was a person, some hiker or camper who got lost, or maybe it was just a bear. But why would it stop at the door? Why did it look like it was watching me? I decided to call the local ranger station, but when I picked up my phone, I realized I had no service. It didn't make sense. The town was only about a half-hour drive away, and I had checked the service map before I arrived. Everything seemed fine, but now my phone was useless. I spent the rest of the day inside, my nerves on edge. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, something that was watching. Every time I looked out the window, the woods seemed darker, denser. The trees felt like they were closing in on me, the shadows in the forest too thick to penetrate. Night fell again, and this time I locked every window and every door. I kept the lights on, the fire crackling in the hearth, but it wasn't enough to make me feel safe. I had that crawling sensation at the back of my neck, the one that told you weren't alone. I heard it again. The scratching, this time louder, more frantic, came from the back of the cabin. I grabbed the flashlight, my hands shaking as I moved toward the door. The wind howled outside, the storm still raging. When I opened the door, the cold hit me like a slap in the face. I stepped out onto the porch and shined the light toward the back of the cabin. There, at the edge of the tree line, I saw it. A figure, tall, hunched over, and impossibly still. It wasn't moving like a person. It was too fluid, too unnatural. It stood there, unmoving, watching me with what felt like a deliberate, calculating stare. I couldn't see its face, but I knew it was looking right at me. The wind howled louder, but I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. I didn't think. I ran. I sprinted back into the cabin, slamming the door behind me. My breath came in ragged gasps, my hands trembling as I locked everything. I stood there for what felt like hours, listening to the wind and the rain, but the scratching stopped. The figure was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed awake, sitting in the chair by the fire, watching the door. The next morning, I couldn't leave fast enough. I grabbed my things, packed up, and left without looking back. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The cabin was just a tiny speck in the distance now, swallowed up by the forest. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me. I don't know what I saw that night, and I don't want to. All I know is that some places, some woods, hold things that don't belong. And once they know you're there, they won't forget you. It was the middle of September when I decided to head out to the cabin my father had left me. It sat out in the woods of northern Michigan, far from any civilization. I hadn't been back there in years, not since I was a kid, and it felt like the right time to finally reconnect with the place. I was 33 now, a little older, a little more weathered, but still craving that peace and quiet I remembered so well. Life in the city had gotten overwhelming, and I needed to clear my head. The road to the cabin was long and bumpy, the kind of gravel trail that seemed to have forgotten its purpose. The trees grew close together, their shadows stretching out across the narrow path as the afternoon sun began to dip lower. I passed a couple of old, abandoned houses on the way, places that looked like they'd been forgotten by time itself. When I finally arrived at the cabin, the sun had already begun to set, casting an orange hue across the landscape. The place looked exactly as I remembered, small and rustic, tucked away beneath the tall pines. The wooden exterior was worn, the porch sagging slightly from years of weathering, but it was still standing strong. The smell of pine and damp earth filled the air, the sound of birds rustling in the trees echoing around me. I unloaded my things, just a backpack, some food, and a cooler of beer, and headed inside. The cabin was simple. A small living room with a fireplace, a tiny kitchen, a single bedroom, and a bathroom that hadn't been updated since the 70s. There was something comforting about its outdatedness. It felt like stepping back in time, like the world outside had kept moving while this place had remained still. I got the fire going and opened a beer, settling in on the couch to enjoy the solitude. The cabin had no Wi-Fi, no cell service, just the crackling of the fire and the occasional creak of the floorboards. It was perfect, or at least I thought it was. That night, I woke up to the sound of something moving around outside. It was subtle at first, like a branch scraping against the side of the house, but it grew louder, closer. I sat up in bed, straining my ears to listen. It was a soft thumping sound, like someone walking around the perimeter of the cabin. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the noise didn't stop. It continued, circling the cabin, slow and deliberate. I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and crept to the window, peeking through the blinds. The moonlight illuminated the yard, casting long shadows across the ground. I saw nothing. I waited for what felt like an eternity, but the noise didn't stop. It continued for hours, growing more and more frantic, until I was nearly shaking with anxiety. What was out there? Who was out there? Was I alone? I finally managed to fall back asleep, but the next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I went outside, checked around the cabin, but there were no signs of anyone having been there. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing. I figured I had been hearing things, my mind playing tricks on me in the quiet of the night. The next day, I went for a walk through the woods, hoping to clear my head. The air was crisp, the forest alive with the rustling of leaves and the distant calls of birds. I had always loved this place, the way the trees felt like they were protecting you from the rest of the world. It was easy to forget about everything that was wrong back home when you were here, surrounded by nature. But as I wandered deeper into the woods, I noticed something strange. There was a path, narrow, barely visible, and it led further into the forest. I hadn't seen this trail before. It wasn't on any of the maps, and I couldn't remember my father ever mentioning it. Curiosity got the best of me, and I decided to follow it. The trail wound its way through the trees, growing darker and more tangled as I went on. The ground beneath me was soft and wet, the air thick with the scent of damp moss. The further I went, the more I felt like I was being drawn into something I couldn't quite understand. I walked for what felt like hours, until I reached a clearing. In the center of the clearing stood an old, decrepit building, a shack of some kind, made of rotting wood and rusted metal. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades, yet there was something about it that made my stomach twist. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the shack, before the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I wasn't alone. I could feel it. The air around me grew heavy, as if something was watching, waiting. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. I turned to leave, but just as I did, I heard a twig snap behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Panic set in. My pulse raced, and I could feel the blood pounding in my ears. I turned back to the path, walking as quickly as I could, until I burst out of the woods and back into the clearing near the cabin. I didn't go back into the woods after that. I spent the next few days inside, locked away in the cabin, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling of unease that had settled deep in my gut. The noises from the night before hadn't stopped. They continued, but now they were closer, louder. Whoever or whatever had been circling the cabin was still out there. One night, I finally snapped. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the rifle my father had left behind and headed out into the yard, determined to confront whatever was out there. The moon was high in the sky, casting an eerie glow over everything. The trees creaked in the wind, and the world felt unnervingly still. I waited, the rifle trembling in my hands, as the noise started again. It was faint at first, but then it grew louder, circling the cabin like it had the night before. My breath caught in my throat, and I aimed the rifle into the darkness, my eyes scanning every shadow. I knew I couldn't let whatever it was get any closer. But then, in the distance, I saw it. A figure, a man maybe, standing in the woods, barely visible in the shadows. I froze, my finger tightening on the trigger, but before I could make a move, the figure disappeared into the trees. I didn't hesitate. I ran inside, bolting the door behind me. My heart was racing, and I could barely breathe as I sat in the corner of the room, staring at the door, waiting for something to happen. The night passed in silence, and by morning, the feeling of being watched had faded. I never saw the figure again, and the noises stopped. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there, something I didn't understand. I packed up my things the next morning, leaving the cabin behind. As I drove away, I glanced back at the woods, wondering what lay hidden in those trees, what secrets my father had kept. I may never know, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't coming back, and maybe that was for the best. It was the kind of night where everything felt off. The sky was an impenetrable black, and the wind whipped through the trees, a steady hum, carrying with it an unsettling chill. I had been looking forward to this weekend for weeks, a chance to escape the chaos of city life and retreat to the small cabin in the woods I had rented. A few days alone, away from everyone, was exactly what I needed. But as the evening wore on, that calm, peaceful retreat began to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a trap. I arrived around midday. The sun was still hanging high, making the forest look peaceful with its gentle rays filtering through the thick canopy. The cabin was old, no doubt about it. Wooden planks creaking underfoot as I entered. There was something charming about it, though. A single room with a massive stone fireplace, a small kitchenette, and a loft above where the bed sat. The furniture was mismatched, but it added to the cabin's rustic appeal. It was exactly what I wanted. I unpacked my things, set my phone to airplane mode, and threw myself onto the bed, feeling the exhaustion of the past few weeks melt away. I went for a short hike, the trees towering above me like silent sentinels, their shadows stretching long across the trail. The air was fresh, pine-scented, and I couldn't help but feel grateful for the silence, broken only by the crunch of leaves beneath my boots. That evening, I made myself dinner, nothing fancy, just pasta and sauce, and ate while sitting on the old couch in front of the fire. Crackled and popped, filling the cabin with warmth. The sound of it, mixed with the howling wind outside, lulled me into a sense of security. Afterward, I sat outside for a while, watching the sky slowly darken into night. The stars were so clear, like pinpricks in a vast black canvas. I could hear the occasional animal in the distance, maybe a deer, maybe something else, but I didn't mind. It felt right, being out there in the middle of nowhere. That was when the first strange thing happened. It was subtle at first, just a feeling, a shift in the atmosphere. The wind, which had been a constant presence since I arrived, suddenly stopped. Dead silence. Not a single rustling leaf. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I brushed it off as my imagination, but something didn't sit right. I turned around and headed back inside. The door shut behind me with a heavy thud. The house felt colder now, despite the fire still burning. I added a few more logs, trying to push the unease aside. I sat back down on the couch, staring into the flames, willing myself to relax. That's when I heard it, a soft thud, coming from above, the loft where the bed was. I froze, every muscle in my body locking up. My first instinct was to rationalize it. Maybe the wind had shifted and something had fallen, or maybe an animal had gotten inside. But the more I thought about it, the more my heart started to pound. There were no animals in the cabin. I had checked the place thoroughly when I first arrived, and there was no wind. Not now. Another thud, louder this time. I stood up, my knees weak. My hands trembled as I reached for the flashlight sitting on the kitchen counter. I switched it on, its beam slicing through the dark cabin. The loft looked empty, no movement, but my heart wouldn't stop racing. The thudding continued, slower now, as if something was creeping around up there. I wanted to call someone, but my phone was useless, and I didn't know the number for any emergency services up here. I had to deal with this myself. I had no choice. I climbed the narrow stairs to the loft. The steps creaked under my weight, each sound magnified in the silence. My flashlight darted around the room, but there was nothing there. No sign of anyone or anything. Then I saw it. A small, dark shape in the corner of the loft, just barely visible in the shadows. I approached cautiously, my heartbeat hammering in my chest. I had no idea what I was about to find, but I needed to know. I reached the corner and aimed the flashlight down. My breath caught in my throat. A blackened wooden box sat on the floor. It wasn't there earlier. I was sure of it. I stepped closer, my mind racing with questions, and then I noticed something even stranger. The faint smell of something rotten. Against my better judgment, I bent down and lifted the box. It was heavier than I expected, and it smelled like decay, something old and putrid. I set it on the bed and slowly pried it open, the hinges protesting. Inside was a collection of old photographs, yellowed and brittle with age. The first photo that caught my eye was of a woman, probably in her 60s, standing in front of the cabin, smiling at the camera. The woman looked familiar, but I couldn't place her. I flicked through more photos, each one depicting the same woman, standing in the same spot, but growing older with each picture. The last photo was taken years ago. She looked frail, her face worn, her eyes hollow. I stared at the photo, a chill creeping down my spine. My mind raced as I tried to piece everything together. There was something about this cabin, something I wasn't being told. But before I could think any more, the thudding started again. This time it was closer, no longer coming from the loft, but from below. I rushed downstairs, almost tripping over my own feet. The flashlight beam bounced erratically as I moved, my breath ragged in my chest. I reached the living room, scanning the area, but there was no one there. Then a knock came from the door. I stood frozen for a long moment. Was it someone else, someone who lived nearby? I didn't know, but something told me I shouldn't open the door. I couldn't explain why, but I felt like whatever was out there, whatever had been making those noises, wasn't human. I backed away from the door slowly, keeping the beam of the flashlight trained on it. The knocking continued, louder now, as though the person outside was becoming more desperate. I had no choice but to act. I grabbed my backpack, stuffed the photos inside, and made my way to the back window. I wasn't staying here any longer. The knocking turned into pounding. The door rattled in its frame. I threw open the window, crawled through, and didn't look back. I ran. The forest was pitch dark, but I didn't care. I didn't stop until I reached the main road, and even then, I kept running until a passing car finally picked me up. The driver, an old man with a thick accent, didn't ask any questions. He just drove me to the nearest town. I haven't been back to that cabin. Couldn't. And every time I close my eyes, I see that photo of the woman. I don't know who she was, but I know one thing. The cabin wasn't mine to stay in. I think it was hers,